Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello, friends of Noble Mind. Thank you for tuning in today. We're happy to be back after our little period of R&R. We are very excited for you to hear this interview with Dr. Marcela Matos. In it, we talk with her all about shame and what a normal human experience it is, but also what a problem it can become when it becomes pervasive or impacts our sense of self or worth. We also talk about compassion, and particularly her work exploring fears and resistance to compassion. That is what makes it hard to give and receive compassion. Dr. Marcela Matos is a clinical psychologist and faculty research fellow at the Center for Research in Neuropsychology and Cognitive Behavioral Intervention at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. She has done extensive training in compassion-focused therapy and has authored more than 70 scientific papers on topics of compassion, shame, regulation, self-criticism, psychopathology, and well-being. She's the chair of the Compassionate Mind Portugal, researcher for the Compassionate Mind Foundation, and member of the Portuguese Association for Mindfulness. She has recently been the lead on a global research project exploring the protective role of compassion during the COVID-19 pandemic. You can learn more about Dr. Matos, get this episode's show notes, and join our email list by visiting noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the show. So we are here with Dr. Marcela Matos. Thank you so much for joining us on Noble Mind. And why don't we just start by having you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Oh, thank you, Kate and Alex, for your very kind invitation. I'm a fan of your podcast, and it was such a pleasure to receive your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm based at the University of Coimbra, where I'm a faculty researcher at the Center for Research in Neuropsychology and Cognitive Behavioral Interventions. So I do clinical work, but mostly focus on research over the past 15 years. The broad scope relates to evolutionary clinical psychology and contextual behavioral approaches, in particular compassion-based interventions, compassion-focused therapy in particular. I would say there are like two major streams in my research, one related to shame and shame memories, and another one related to compassion.
Wonderful. Maybe we'll dive into the shame topic first, since it's so easy to avoid shame. Why don't we just get started? Just dive right in there. So a lot of us are even ashamed to talk about shame. So maybe you could just give us a little sense of how do you think about shame? You know, how do you sort of define or think about it? Sometimes it gets conflated with embarrassment, humiliation. There's so many words that kind of live together, but we often don't tease them out. I suspect you have, so maybe you could help us with that a little.
Yeah, Kate, what you just said is true. Even though most of us are very uncomfortable, feel very uncomfortable and afraid even to talk about our shame and our shame experiences. Shame is a very powerful self-conscious emotion, and it's also a socially focused emotion. This is what's very special about it. And it involves feelings of inferiority, inadequacy, unattractiveness, defectiveness, powerlessness, along with a desire not to be seen, which is a very, very common experience in shame, to avoid exposure, to hide, to try to escape, or to conceal our deficiencies. So shame is generally regarded as a particularly intense, painful, and very incapacitating emotion. And usually it comes along with two dimensions in this experience. And these are, first, the experience of ourselves, how we believe to exist in the minds of the others. So how we believe and feel others judge ourselves, think about us, and feel about us. And this is also known as external shame. And then this experience of the self as it exists for others can also be internalized in the way we feel about ourselves, we think and judge ourselves in a particularly negative way. So this would be very broadly a definition of shame. What I think I would like to highlight is the fact that even though we don't talk about our shame experiences are ubiquitous in our lives. They occur for all of us, and they are present throughout our lives, since early in life through adulthood. And so shame can occur within ourselves, even when no one else is watching. And most of the times it occurs between us, with other people. And shame can also occur in the broader social group, for example, and also at social and cultural levels. So shame is critical to our psychosocial development, to our psychological functioning, to how we navigate our social relationships. And it deeply affects our sense of ourselves, how we interact with other people, how we form and we maintain social relationships. And it also impacts many of the life choices we go on to make in our lives.
There's so many places to go from just what you said. I feel like, okay, let's just unpack that for the rest of the hour.
So right.
I'm thinking one question that's coming up for me just from that last bit you said is about what might be helpful about shame or useful or critical about shame. Because I know for me, I just think shame, like, I don't want that. I don't like that. How is it, like you said, it serves a social function. So it would be helpful to think about what might be useful about it.
So the idea behind this social function of shame, not only shame, but of all other emotions, comes from evolutionary psychology. And over the last few decades, there has been a lot written about this adaptive function of shame from this evolutionary perspective. A particular model here is the evolutionary biopsychosocial model of shame that was developed by Professor Paul Gilbert in the UK. And according to this model, the propensity for us humans to feel shame is believed to be rooted in our evolved socially competitive motives. So shame arises from us being a self-aware, identity-forming, and highly social species that compete. We compete for a social place, for a place in the social hierarchy. So shame emerges from these innate motives that we all have to form attachments to each other, to belong to groups, to seek social status. And because of these innate motives that we all share as human beings, and because social relationships are so fundamentally and crucially related to our survival as a species, they regulate our psychological functioning, our physiological well-being. Because of this, we have basic needs to appear attractive in the eyes of other people, to be seen positively in the minds of the other people around us, to be thought fondly in the minds of others. So as humans, we have this unique capacity for social understanding and also for self-conscious awareness. But these two capacities are also the source of human suffering through shame. So our evolved human brains give us this ability to be self-aware and to understand ourselves and other human beings. But in this process, our minds also give us the abilities to confront ourselves with what it means to having our deficits, our flaws, potentially exposed to others, judged by them. These, of course, coupled with the internal experience of the self as shameful and flawed. So this relates to the adaptive function of shame. Shame acts as a warning signal that others might view us in a negative way. So others might view us as having negative qualities or lacking positive qualities. And that because of that, we are at risk of being rejected by them, being excluded, or even being persecuted and harmed by other people. So if we think about this, the implications of this for our prehistoric human fellows were isolation, extreme vulnerability, and ultimately death if we were excluded from the social group. So that's why basic defensive responses emerge when shame is triggered, because these defensive responses that can be nonverbal or behavioral, like, for example, the desire to appear small, to appear weak, submissive responses, trying or attempting to flight, escape, conceal, all of these responses are designed to limit social damage, to restore our image in the eyes of the other people, our social reputation, to try to de-escalate social conflict and repair the potential damage that shame can cause to the social bonds. So in a way, ultimately, shame tries to prevent us from being rejected, excluded, or harmed by others. And that's why it is adaptive.
Interesting. You write that internalized shame response may be a major defensive strategy to external shame. Like the harsh self-blaming, self-persecution is actually a way to defend oneself from external shame. Is that right?
Yes. Shame, according to Paul Gilbert's this evolutionary biopsychosocial model of shame, at the core of the shame experience is external shame. So here's how we experience the self as existing negatively in the minds of other people. And when this happens, when we have this experience of external shame, what can also, and most of the time happens, is that we internalize this experience of how we think and feel that we exist for others. And when we do that, in a way, this internalized, as you were just saying, Alex, this internalized shame response is a defense to shame. Why? Because by self-monitoring, by self-criticizing, we are internalizing the critical other. So we ourselves will try to prevent ourselves to do things, say things, be things that we anticipate others will reject.
So then we kind of police our own boundary in a way of what we put out into the world or do or say, because we're sort of on the inside saying, someone may not like that, someone may criticize that. So that internalized shame is like an added fence or something to sort of keep us from expressing it.
Exactly, Kate. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
It's also very curious. You're right. External shame is associated with paranoid ideation, paranoid anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Internal shame is related to social anxiety, which I thought was fascinating.
This was a result of one of our studies that we found very interesting, because the way that these two dimensions of shame are related to social worriness processes. It's very interesting because external shame is all about how this ability that we have to think about and mentalize about what's going on in the mind of other people and how we exist for them, how they feel about us. So that's why in our view, in this study that we've done, we found that external shame was especially important in relation to paranoid ideation. So to this idea that others can have malevolent intentions towards the self. Whereas this internalized shame response, so the internal shame, which is much more inwardly directed and focuses on one's deficits, one's flaws, is much more related to the experience of social anxiety. And this idea that what Kate was just saying, so which is when we think about social anxiety, we think, of course, there's always the fear of how others evaluate us. But at the core of the social anxiety experience is also this notion and this idea that we are something or someone that we don't want to be. And we need to control or prevent or mask certain characteristics, attributes, behaviors that can be judged negatively by others. Otherwise, we can be rejected by them.
So it's an extremely painful whole body experience. What are some practical ways that shame is damaging for humans and get in the way of happiness and effective functioning?
So shame as an emotion, for the past 20, 30 years, there's been mounting research that shows the pathogenic impacts of shame. So even though shame, and this is very important to stress, shame is normal, shame is adaptive, we all experience it throughout our lives. But shame can be a transient, common, passing feeling, but it can become a very incapacitating, prolonged experience that is very easily triggered, for example. And when that happens, when individuals have shame experiences that then become internalized into intense internal shame feelings and external shame feelings, we know that this shame can then be associated with a range of psychopathology symptoms. For example, we know that external and internal shame are associated with increased levels of depression, with increased anxiety, social anxiety, as we've just discussed. Shame is also at the core of the experience of psychopathologies such as eating disorders, for example. Also, it's a very central emotion in post-traumatic stress disorder, but also in other disorders such as psychotic disorders, psychopathy. So it's seen as this transdiagnostic emotion that it's present in a whole range of psychopathologies. And this is because shame, so this shame changes. When shame emerges, shame changes our mental states. And it prompts these coordinated, threat-related neuronal and psychobiological responses that have enduring consequences for how we process emotionally and cognitively what's happening around us. And so this can damage our well-being. And at the same time, I think shame can form part of one's identity. Our identity can become closely linked to our shamed self in the way that we start seeing us as flawed, unlovable, inferior to others, or as failures, and these descriptors become who we are.
So it started as a response to how we perceived others responding to us. Then we start to internalize that and criticize or reject ourselves. And then we develop this identity of, I'm no good, I'm unworthy, I'm destined to be rejected. Or I can see how that sort of thread goes forward and creates that over time. I have an example I'm going to share from my own life, and we can circle back to it as we talk about this, because I feel like it might be helpful for other people, and it's easy to get abstract about this stuff too. So something very specific would be good. So I gave a talk a couple of years ago that went very badly in my eyes. I was very sick. I had the flu, like a fever, the whole shebang. And I just felt like, I felt awful about it. And, the talk ended, people were polite, whatever. A few people said it was good, but mostly I just felt like it was awful. And I was like, just preoccupied with it for like a couple days afterwards, just like, And then, it kind of faded over time. But every once in a while, for some random reason, like that'll pop up in my mind and I'll go like, like all over again. That talk went so bad, and I can sort of share it and see the sort of absurdity of it a little bit. But also like, I feel like there's shame, but also like trying to tease that out from just kind of embarrassment, or like, I wonder if you could help understand that or help me understand that experience a little bit.
Yes, Kate, the experience that you've just described is such a common experience, isn't it? You have that experience in public speaking, so you were giving a talk, but so many people have similar experiences, in social relationships, when they're talking to someone else, if they are asked something. So what's interesting in your experience is that, and what it defines it as a shame experience, is that even though other people didn't, they were, as you said, polite about it, they were kind, they say it was a great talk, I'm sure. For you, as you were giving it, and in the circumstances that happened, as you were saying, because you were not feeling great, you felt that probably as you were doing it, other people were not or could not. Maybe they did not, were not finding it interesting, or you were not doing as well as you thought you could do. And what would that mean? Would people see me as, inadequate, inferior, not as good of a speaker as I would like to be? And so that then became completely fused with how you felt also, that you were not up to your standards, regardless of how it actually went. And this is what distinguishes it from just a simple embarrassment. The embarrassment experiences are much more mild, and they are not related to this. They are not connected to this toxic kind of very painful feeling that other people might be judging me negatively because of this, or criticize. Maybe they were just polite. That happens to me many times. It happened to me before. Just an example, just like you were saying, instances that you feel, even though people are responsive, that you feel it's, maybe they are just being polite and kind.
Right.
And even though we have positive reinforcing signals, we become stuck in this feeling that I was something that I did not want to be in that situation.
Yeah. And also, as you're talking, I'm realizing, as you were saying before, that external shame, how it's connected to sort of paranoia, because like people asked questions, and my interpretation of the question is like, they're doubting me. That's critical. Like, like I'm sort of like taking the feedback, but then sort of distorting or interpreting it in a kind of paranoid way.
Yes, totally. And probably in other instances, in other talks that you've given that happened, I'm reporting to my own experience, for example. In instances where I'm, for example, giving a talk or talking to someone, if my experience of how it's going is good, then I interpret the signals that people are giving me, the nods of the heads, the questions, and, as, interest, and a signal that it's going well. But if I'm having this internal experience that maybe it's not going that well, or that if someone, for example, leaves the room, or starts, people start talking between each other, it's very easy for us to, in certain situations, just go into that idea that it's me. And then we become stuck in that place, and it's very hard to be attentive or interpret the signals, such as, for example, questions, which are always a signal that people are interested in what you just said. Something else that you said that I thought it was very interesting was the fact that experience, you were stuck with that experience for a while. And I don't know if that happens to you, but it happens to me with past shame experience that I have, where they come up for me. When I'm in a similar situation, they come up. And this is something else that we can talk about, but this is something that is very common also in shame experiences.
This feels connected to the experience of trauma. And I know you talk about how shame memories can be a kind of trauma memory. So maybe this is a good place to pivot, because as we're talking about shame memories come back, they sort of haunt you. They reemerge later on. It starts to feel more like those trauma memories. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your thinking around that.
Yes. Early shame experiences and their resulting effects on how our threats physiological system is activated, and this sense of threatened social self can take form in shame memories, basically. So we've done a lot of research over the years on this. And if I just, for example, I'm going to invite you and our listeners to do just a little thought experiment. Okay, so if you try and bring to mind just a mild example, just like the one Kate described, from early on in your life or in your adulthood, of a shame experience. an instance where you felt inadequate, inferior, some kind of social faux pas that might have happened, or where you experienced rejection, or you were excluded by other people. And when that memory comes to mind, notice what happens in your body as we think about this past shame experience.
Yeah, I feel heat on my on my cheeks.
Hot flush in the face. I have sweat on my hands. We all have these experiences. Briefly thinking about this, even though we don't talk about this experience and it's very hard for us to disclose them, shame is a universal human experience. And the minute we think about this, we will start feeling a hot flush in the face. We can, experience a slumped posture or a bow of the head. We want to hide or escape, or we think, I am not able to disclose this to anyone. I hope no one asks me about it. I hope Marcela doesn't ask me what it was. So we all have these types of experiences. And what we found in our research, when we try to explore the qualities of these memories, is that these shame experiences from our past can have qualities very similar to those associated with other types of trauma. For example, we know that some of the psychological consequences and symptoms associated with trauma, for example, imagine if we have a motor vehicle accident, we will experience intrusive symptoms. For example, thoughts and images of the accident will repeatedly come to mind. We will have, for example, avoidance symptoms where we will avoid talking about, thinking about, or being near to anything related to cars or to driving for a while, for example. And we'll also experience hyperarousal symptoms where we might feel anxious, angry, easily startled whenever, for example, we see a car or if we are about to drive. So shame memories operate very much like this, with these same kinds of effects, as if shame experiences were themselves traumas. Mm-hmm. And they are, because in a way, shame experiences are social and relational traumas. And this is what our research has shown, is that shame memories operate as trauma-like memories, and they trigger this intrusive hyperarousal and avoidance symptoms, much like other types of trauma.
Now, you were making this distinction that shame, you were normalizing shame, that everyone experiences continually almost. It's sort of like hunger or something. There are times when we're going to experience it. At the same time, you're saying that it can be traumatic. Now, for shame experiences to become traumatic and central to identity, is that related to attachment figures, experiences with attachment figures, whether they become central or not?
So that's a very, very interesting question and important one, Alex, because in the research we've conducted, so we've interviewed hundreds of people about their shame experiences. While conducting those many, many interviews, what I found was that it's not the shame experience per se that it's different. So of course we can have, there are shame experiences that are much more severe. If we think about abuse, emotional neglect, of course those experiences are, when you think about them, you can see how they are traumatic. But what we found, and this is what's interesting, is that common experiences like being criticized by a teacher, being rejected by peers if I want to play football with them, being negatively compared to my younger sister, constantly, for example, by my parents, or not having positive qualities or talents valued, for example, by my parents or by my teachers. These experiences that happen, every day can become traumatic. So the question is, why? Why? Because why is it that for some people, these experiences are shame experiences that they can even become central to identity and have traumatic qualities, but what distinguishes these experiences from other people's experiences that go on to impact our mental well-being, their mental well-being. So maybe a distinction here is that we can all have these experiences, and for some of us, depending on the frequency of the experience, who the shamer was, what you were referring to regarding attachment figures, we found, for example, that shame experiences with attachment figures in particular, so with our parents or another significant person in our lives that took care of us, these can become particularly traumatic early in life. But we also know that, for example, in adolescence, experiences of shame in the peer group can be also very traumatic and become central to identity. So the idea here is that we have these experiences that can become more or less traumatic, and they can become central to our identity and to how we see our life and perceive our past and anticipate our future. But there are factors that we did not research all of them, but we had that question. So we tried to understand what could help us understand what can, in a sense, buffer or accentuate the impact of shame memories on our psychological well-being. So what we found in regard to that question is that if we have a shame experience that becomes traumatic and central to our identity, but at the same time, if we also have our other emotional affiliative memories of being nurtured, cared for as a child within our family, for example, or within the wider social group, if we have these positive affiliative experiences, these experiences will buffer against the impact of shame memories. So it's very important. So this idea that even though we can have these traumatic memories of shame, if we have other experiences that in a way balance out the impact of these in our threat system activation, then we will, in a way, these positive experiences within our family and with other people in the wider social domain can, in a way, provide opportunities for reparation of our social bonds and also of the way we perceive ourselves in the minds of the others and how we come to define ourselves in terms of our self-identity. So this is a key factor. Then there is another one also.
So I'm really heartened that you emphasize that this is repairable.
Yeah.
The opposite of shame experiences, I suppose, is the experiences of a sense of being loved, accepted, valued, cared for, safe. So that's like it's the nemesis.
Alex, I loved your expression. It's the nemesis of shame. And compassion and love and care and warmth is the antidote for shame. And in our research, so when I was doing this research, I did these interviews about shame experiences, both with people from the general population with no diagnosed mental health difficulty, but I also conducted these interviews with around 200 patients with different types of diagnoses of mental health disorders. And this was a key distinction between having or not having, for example, in terms of shame experience, a mental health disorder or a mental health problem or difficulty, because what we found was that in people with mental health difficulties, they can have even similar experiences than everyone else, but the distinction is they either cannot access, they cannot recall positive affiliative experience. It's very hard for them to access this other type. It's a different type of mental state, isn't it? It's a different type of motivational system. They don't have access to it, and most of them cannot recall many positive affiliative experiences, for example, in their childhood with their attachment figures. And this, of course, comes then along with a lot of consequences for their emotional regulation, mental well-being. And yes, so compassion here emerges, and these affiliative experiences emerge as very powerful antidotes to shame and to shame memories.
You had been listing two things and you stopped after one. I want to make sure to circle back.
Yes.
Because our listeners will be like, where's the second?
What is the second one? So the second one is compassion. So we have... So we did this research where we discovered this that I've just spoken about these positive experiences of warmth and safeness. And we also had the question, so what about compassion? Can compassion, there was this idea that compassion was the antidote to shame, but can compassion be the antidote, the nemesis for shame memories? So this is what we did. So I teamed up with my dear colleague, Sten Steindl, who I believe was a
friend of the show.
Yes, a friend of the show. And we did this study where we looked at the protective effects of compassion and of self-compassion, and of receiving compassion from other people against the pervasive impact of shame memories on depression, on anxiety, and also on feelings of safeness. And what we found was that the higher our abilities to be compassionate towards ourselves and to be open to receive compassion from other people, the less traumatic impact of our shame memories and their centrality to our identity. And very importantly, what we found was that self-compassion, so our ability to be compassionate towards ourselves, buffered against the impact of these traumatic and central shame memories on symptoms of depression and anxiety. And it also helped to increase positive feelings of safeness and contentedness.
When we interviewed Professor Paul Gilbert, of course, he had spoken about his three affect regulation systems, the threat system, the drive system, the soothing system. And you write that the problem with shame is that it's a triple whammy. The social threat activates the threat system, threat of separation and social setback, interferes with the drive system. And because there's a threat of disconnection and lack of safeness, that messes up the soothing system, so they're out of whack.
Exactly. And that's what's so unique about shame. And it's also why it's such a central emotional experience in our lives. And it can be so pathogenic because it's not just... of course, it's very important that it's a social, it activates our threat system because it signals major social threats to how we navigate social relationships and to our sense of self. But at the same time that it does that, it also represents a failure to attain, or a possibility of failing to attain very important, for example, biosocial motives and goals, which is related to the drive system. And at the same time, it represents the underdevelopment or the blocking of the affiliative soothing system, which is the system that provides us with these opportunities for connection and support, warmth, care that we need to repair the effects of shame and to suffer less.
So you mentioned there's a protocol that you've developed. Would this be maybe a good time to explain a little bit about that some more? People might be wondering, what's this protocol? That sounds useful.
It's more or less a protocol or some guidelines that basically try to orientate clinical work with individuals that are very shame prone, or that reveal traumatic shame memories, or for whom these memories have a very important and distinct impact on their symptoms. So basically, this protocol encompasses, on the one hand, the assessment of shame and shame memories. So it's basically a compassionate, so it's based on compassion focused therapy, and it stresses on the one hand, the need to assess both shame and shame memories we can do that through self-report instruments that are available, and some of which we've developed, and also through, for example, semi-structured interviews that we can use to assess these shame experiences and their qualities, their traumatic, their centrality qualities. Then we believe that it's very important also to assess the coping strategies that people develop to deal with shame, and with these shame experiences then that can become ongoing or very recurrent coping strategies that people used in their lives in similar situations. Then it's important to be aware of the frequency and the triggering cues of the shame memories. And in the clinical formulation, the case formulation, we believe that it's important to incorporate shame and shame memories, these early emotional memories, which, by the way, this is nothing new. So if we look at compassion-focused therapy and case formulation in compassion-focused therapy, this is all there. And then, of course, alongside the compassion-focused therapy and the practices, the exercises that aim at reduce resistances to compassion, promote one's affiliative and soothing system, and cultivate self-compassion and compassion competencies and abilities. It is important to target shame, to work with shame, and also to work with shame memories, using both interventions and strategies derived from traumatic or trauma-focused psychotherapy interventions, such as rescripting of emotional memory, trying to reconstruct the meaning of these autobiographical memories of shame. So there are a lot of specific interventions that in these cases we can do, but it's very important here to stress that the therapeutic setting and the therapeutic relationship on its own, even though it can be a potential stage to evoke, one's resistances to compassion or resistances to disclose shame feelings or shame experiences, it is a very important stage where these innate abilities that we have to be compassionate towards ourselves and to receive compassion from other people, to develop our affiliative soothing system, this can be played out in this therapeutic setting, and these competencies can be developed, and we know that they are key to counteract the negative impacts of shame and shame memories.
Now, an important term to underline for listeners is fears of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
So in concert with Professor Paul Gilbert, you've investigated these, and it's a very juicy topic. There's a lot to this.
Yeah, so it's true. It was something that, as Professor Paul Gilbert had the opportunity to talk here about, he was developing compassion-focused therapy, and we're doing this research around compassion and compassion-focused therapy. It became clear that even though compassion was, we know that it plays a fundamental role, protective role in mental states, emotional regulation, social relationships. So it is a key protective factor against a range of psychopathologies. It became clear to us that, and it was clear to Professor Paul Gilbert, that there are some people, and for some individuals in particular, it can be very frightening, and they can become very, very resistant of developing compassion. So in these individuals, what we believe happens is that they are unable to activate and use these caring, compassionate, motivational systems and affect regulators that we all share as humans. And because of that, they can experience and develop fears, resistances, and blocks to being compassionate towards other people, to receive compassion from other people, and also to be self-compassionate. So, for example, fears of compassion can include, for example, the belief that compassion is weak, or is a self-indulgence, or that one can become too distressed or unable to cope if we become compassionate to oneself or to others. Or, for example, we can believe that we do not deserve compassion, or that other people are not deserving of compassion, or that other will abuse us if we become compassionate, for example, if we are compassionate towards them. So there are a whole range of resistances, fears, and blocks that are related to our emotional experiences in our lives. And so these fears of compassion are believed to be derived from early emotional experiences, amongst which shame is one of them.
Just maybe one more question and then we'll move towards wrapping up. Connected to fear of compassion, something timely. You've recently been involved in research looking at fear of compassion and perceived threat of COVID. Wondering if you could just share a little bit about that, what that study found.
So we very recently, so when the pandemic hit last year, I had this idea, which was so this was a completely novel context. There was as a species, we, in a time like this, where we are aware and we can communicate about this, because there were other pandemics, but not with
not with Zoom.
Not with Zoom, exactly. And so there was this idea. So how about what is the role? So everyone was talking about the mental health impact of the pandemic, and we were expecting that to be a significant one. But our interest was actually, can compassion protect against this impact? And can fears of compassion actually magnify the impact of the pandemic, of the perceived threat of COVID-19 on mental health and psychosocial well-being? So we designed this project. This is a longitudinal project that it's ongoing. The first results are already out, but that it's ongoing, where we brought together this compassion community, this community of researchers and practitioners all around the world. So it's 44 compassion researchers and practitioners from 21 countries around the world. And we have already the results from that we collected last year between April and May, in the first wave of the pandemic. And what we found was that perceived threat of COVID-19, as expected, was associated with increased symptoms of anxiety, depression, stress, and decreased social safeness, feelings of social safeness. And then, importantly, we found that fears of compassion were associated, so they predicted, so the more fears of compassion people had, the higher the resistance is to compassion in relation to themselves, to other people, and to receive compassion from others. The higher the symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress, and the lower levels of social safeness people would reveal. And what was striking in this study was that we found that fears of compassion across all flows, so for self, for others, and receiving compassion from others, they amplified the negative impact that this perceived threat of COVID-19 has on symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress. And then we also found that fears of receiving compassion from other people actually amplified the effect of perceived threat of COVID-19 on experiences of social safeness and connectedness to others.
Fascinating. Really looking forward to hearing more about what your findings are as you have more waves of your study results come out, really.
We are very excited about it.
Yes, I know. I'm like waiting with bated breath. Well, Marcela, thank you. This has been a very illuminating conversation. If folks are interested in learning more about shame or compassion or any of the work you do, anywhere they can find you out in the World Wide Web.
Thank you. It was a pleasure also to talk to you, Kate and Alex, about these themes that are a passion, a research passion of mine. And feel free to contact me, everyone. So people can find me on my email and also on my lab website. I can leave those details with you guys. And they can also find me on Facebook and also on other, ResearchGate and all these web research networks that are out there.
Wonderful. We'll share some of your contact info on our show notes page. Thank you so much, Marcela. This was lovely.
Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. It was lovely to meet you, and it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.